Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Trish, and I'm an evaluation and research consultant with the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology, and I'll be facilitating the session today. And I am joined by my colleague, Bruce, who will be helping with the general flow of the session as well as moderating the chat. So if you have any questions or concerns or technical problems, please feel free to type a message in the chat and he'll be moderating that. And he'll be reminding me when I need to pause and address some of the concerns or questions that are coming up. It's a little too much for me to multitask, so please send any private messages or messages directly to him. And with that, I will go ahead and get started. Okay, so as I've already said, my name is Trish, and my ancestors come from Portugal, both the mainland and the Azores Islands. And I like to honor the existence of the first peoples from the land that I'm here presenting and sharing with you today, which is, for me, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh in the area that's known today as Vancouver. I recognize that many of you are joining us from areas all over Canada, all over the world potentially, and I'm so glad to have you joining us. And I really appreciate being able to share with you today from this space because it's given me so much to learn, so many opportunities to learn, both about myself and about others. So I'm really excited to be sharing all of this with you today. Okay. So just as a sort of overview, I've already introduced myself and Bruce, and I just want to give you a sense of what we'll be covering in this workshop and specifically what we mean by inclusivity. So designing a good survey and both questions and items is one thing, but also making them inclusive is another piece. So by making your survey inclusive, you're enabling yourself to gather more data by reaching more people, by making your survey accessible and readable. So I don't want to think about inclusivity as sort of limiting to a certain category of people, but it's making it accessible for everyone. And most importantly, that inclusivity shouldn't be an afterthought. As you're designing your survey each step of the way, thinking about whether the survey is inclusive and whether everyone can access and understand these questions. And I include this little screen cap of an article here. It's by some authors out of UBC who looked at basically this idea of how different linguistic characteristics of multiple choice questions, questions which many of us use in our lectures and classroom settings, can really impact student learning. And so they looked at how reducing the linguistic complexity can actually improve comprehension for English as a second language students. And I think this just really highlights, this isn't about survey design, but it really highlights this piece about inclusivity and making sure that items that you think maybe everyone understands or are clear to everyone or have a clear purpose to everyone, really thinking about what that means and making sure that they are clear and accessible. Okay. And so the overall objectives of today's workshop are to help you gain confidence in deciding whether surveys are the right tool for you in your research and evaluation questions, helping you develop confidence in selecting different question styles, and learning about some of the best practices for using surveys and administering them. And I invite you to make a copy of the slides. Bruce, could I just ask you to share again the link to the slides? I'm just seeing a lot of people are still coming into the session, so I just want to make sure that that link is accessible for everyone. It'll also be shared at the end of the survey. You'll get an email from our events team with a link to the slides. Okay. So it's just like this little comic. I thought it was appropriate. And I needed a mid-afternoon laugh. So when we come into doing surveys and designing surveys, we always kind of think about, I wish I knew all of the answers. I want to know how my students feel, how they're experiencing this, how my teaching team feels about this new technique. But it's not just about, wanting these answers. The difficult part is really coming up with the questions. And so what I'd like to get a sense of is just how many of you have used a survey before to collect student data. So I'm just going to pop up a quick poll, just a simple yes, no, just to get a sense of how many of you are familiar with survey design or have used it in your classroom or teaching learning settings before. So just give you a moment or two to fill that out. I don't know if you guys can see this. Hopefully you can. I've just shared the results. So 98% of you have used this survey to collect data before. So that's the vast majority, and that's great. For those of you who haven't, no worries at all. Hopefully this will give you a very big picture overview of how survey design works. And for those of you who have, I hope that you're still able to take away some lessons from today's session. And the other kind of feedback that I'd like to get is just about whether you have any specific questions about using surveys. If there's something in particular that you're really hoping to get out of this workshop, just invite you to type that in the chat. I'll just give maybe 2 minutes for that. Then I'll have Bruce monitor it, and then at the end of the session, we'll have some time for discussion. And so Bruce will curate some of the questions, and we'll see if some themes come up. And if I haven't had a chance to address them today, then we'll take some time to talk about those. So just give everyone about 2 minutes to type any burning questions that they have that they're hoping to get feedback on. Okay, awesome. I saw some little chats pinging on the side of my screen. So that's awesome. I'm glad some of you have some questions that you have in mind. Hopefully I'll answer some of them for you in the presentation. But as I said, if not, we do have some time at the end, so we can come back to those. Okay, so I know you're all here because you want to learn about inclusive survey design, but I think an important piece to think about when you're coming at a research or evaluation question is, why are you doing a survey? And this session will focus on survey design, but there are alternative techniques for getting to your questions, such as focus groups or interviews, for example. And it's really important to think about whether a survey is the best option for you. I just want to spend a minute talking about situations in which surveys work and sort of some of the advantages of surveys, as well as some disadvantages. Because oftentimes we see people say like, oh, I want to survey my students to get their feedback. And that's fine and good, but sometimes a survey isn't necessarily the best tool. And so just kind of want to think about when a survey is the best tool and why you should choose a survey in that situation. So some of the advantages of surveys are that you can connect with a large number of participants. So if you have a class of 300 students, you can gather feedback from a large majority of them quite easily. Or interviewing or having a focus group with a large number could be quite difficult. Likewise, it's easier to connect with a broader range of people. So, for example, students that are international and not actually physically in your classroom right now that you might not be able to connect with as easily, or alumni who are no longer present and harder to connect with. It's quite inexpensive in terms of time and cost to administer compared to something like focus groups or interviews. You can pretty easily integrate it into a class activity. So looking at things like mid-course feedback or kind of getting a snapshot of the current classroom climate can be done quite easily through a survey within the class. And there are also free tools that can be used. So at UBC, we use Qualtrics, which is HIPAA compliant, and all the data is stored locally. Okay, on the flip side, what are some of the disadvantages of survey? So one thing, which hopefully I'll be able to help you with today, is balancing that length and coverage. So you might have many questions that you want to ask, and your survey ends up being 15 pages long. That can be problematic. It can lead to things like not very thorough responses from students, or students not responding at all. Results can be really dependent on the wording. This is a concern people often have, is how do I make sure that the items I'm including aren't biased, or that students understand and my questions are inclusive. Again, hopefully things that we'll be able to address today. As I said, responses can be biased by those who choose to participate. So depending on how you advertise the survey or who chooses to participate, you might be getting data or information from only a subset of your students. Response rates tend to not be too high. In surveys that I've done I do see a huge range between 20 and like 80% of students in a classroom will participate sometimes. So it's not a reliable way to get feedback from everyone in your classroom. And respondents might not be able to truly express their thoughts or concerns because they're limited by the questions that you ask, in contrast to something like perhaps an interview or a focus group where they might have more of a chance to sort of insert ideas a little bit more easily. So a lot of these disadvantages are disadvantages to surveys, but are also in some cases, particularly the first couple points, are ones that can be overcome. And hopefully I'll give you some tricks for doing that later on. Again, thinking about when a survey is the right tool. Like I said, many people say, oh, I want to do a survey and get feedback. It's a really popular tool, but make sure that it's the right tool for the information that you want to collect. So what you need to think about when you say something generic, like I want to collect student feedback, is thinking about what your specific research or evaluation question is, and what type of evidence or information or data do you need to answer that question, and what tool might be the right one to collect that evidence. So it's really important to kind of, before you just say, oh, I want to do a survey, why do you want to do a survey? What kind of information are you looking for? And how would you get that information? What data would give you the information that you need to answer that question? And so what I want to do now is spend about 5 to 8 minutes, say, looking at what those of you want to do. I know we have quite a big group, but I'm hoping some of you will feel comfortable sharing your feedback in the chat. And just, you don't need to have come to this session with a research question in mind, or be planning to do a survey in the next coming weeks or months. But if you've done a survey in the past, you could speak to that as well. So just ask that you take a few minutes and type in the chat some of the pieces of information that you've in the past tried to learn from surveys, or in the future hope to learn from surveys, just to get a sense of the areas and questions that people have. And to also, I think for me, it's always exciting to look at the diversity of questions that people have. And I think it'll be interesting for your peers as well to see what type of evaluations people are doing in their different teaching settings. Awesome. Thank you, David and Ray, for sharing your responses so far. So things are looking like whether learning was successful with a specific module topic, looking at questions about how often students participate or peers participate in certain social media activities, looking at things like what problems that people might have encountered in different areas. So thank you, Sarah, looking at a survey to get an idea. So in the past, I've already done a survey looking at issues to address around justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And in the future, doing a survey about informing course design. We work quite a lot with people doing different types of program and course initiatives and learning about, what could people be doing differently? This is awesome. Thanks, Nopuru. Under the remote teaching environment, looking at evaluating the effectiveness of various online virtual laboratory experiment sessions. Oh, I'm very interested in that. I'm so intrigued by the different types of remote teaching that people are doing, and working in a virtual laboratory sounds like there'd be a lot of challenges. Right now we're working with a lot of people trying to understand, what's going on in remote teaching, what are students liking or not liking. Awesome. Thank you, Francis. I want to be able to measure a perceived change in attitude, motivation, and intercultural competency, the warm and fuzzy. I like that idea, the warm and that sort of atmosphere, how that's being captured. Awesome. These are great. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. I like taking this opportunity because I think it helps people think about, okay, what am I actually asking? And, sometimes taking a step back and thinking, okay, will a survey actually help me address this? Is a useful mindset to have. I think it's just neat to see the different types of questions that people are asking. So this is fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. Okay. So you've had a little bit of time to think, and perhaps you'll need a bit more time in the future as well, if this is a long-term big picture goal. So if after you've gone through and thought about your research question and the type of data that you want to collect and who your participants are and how you're going to reach them, you still decide that a survey is right for you, then you'll be doing a survey, and hopefully the next half hour or so, I'll be able to give you some tips on best practices for survey design and what that looks like. So just looking at some best practices in survey design and how to make sure that your surveys are inclusive and that you're reaching the people that you want to reach and asking questions that are relevant to your research. So this is kind of one of our claims that we always make, or a slogan, I guess we have on the research and evaluation team, which is only to ask questions that will help you answer your research question. And kind of in line with that, just because you could ask something doesn't mean that you should ask something. It's very easy to sort of get carried away and think, oh, I'll just add one more item, or like, well, what about this one other feature? And like, oh, I should also ask them about this. So it's really important to start off with having a grounded research or evaluation question, and knowing sort of what are the main things that you're trying to get out of this survey, and narrowing it down as much as possible. Another piece related to this is, again, with the sense of narrowing and focusing on a specific question, is asking yourself whether you're using multiple questions to get at one concept or variable. So say, for example, you want to get at a sense of belonging. You might choose to use a pre-existing validated scale, or a number of items that you've come up with yourself. But what you really want to make sure of is that you're able to capture the thing you want to know, but also doing it in a way that is understandable to your participants and also understandable to you. So what I mean by this is, say you're like, well, I don't really know how to define this, and so I'm going to ask 5 questions about this idea, this concept. Then you get your data back, and perhaps for each of your questions, the answers vary quite a bit. So for one question, majority of the students strongly agree with your statement, and for the other one, they don't agree with it, or they do agree with it, and you get varying responses based on the question that you ask. And so thinking about how you would collapse this to say, okay, how is something like comfort in the classroom actually understood by my students? Well, when you ask it this way, they feel this way. When you ask it this way, they feel this way. And so that's why one reason that I'd recommend using a validated scale for something like a concept like self-efficacy, for example, if one exists. Or you're just being careful about not asking the same question in multiple ways, which might confuse your students and might give you quite varying data. Another thing that I recommend with regard to this is imagining how you would write up the results at the end. So even if you don't have intentions of writing this up in a research journal or any sort of publication, just think about how you would want to talk about the data that you've collected. So, I surveyed X number of students in X, Y, and Z course, and by asking them question, I was able to determine that 95% of students agree that teaching tool X was beneficial for their learning experience. I think that helps you pull out what your key questions are, as well as what the concepts are that you're trying to measure. So sometimes it's easy to write a question, but then it can be difficult later kind of understanding what the responses mean. So it's sort of a bit of a backwards approach, but I always find that if I think about how I would write something up in a publication, it helps me think about, okay, well, here's this survey, and here are all the questions, and here are all the responses, but actually, the key takeaway that I'm hoping to learn is about the benefits of this tool, and I actually don't ask about the benefits of this tool. So kind of just making sure that there's a link between the questions that you're asking and what your ultimate research goals are. And I know this seems like, okay, well, Trish, we should be doing that. Hopefully we're doing that already. But I think it can be easy sometimes. And I find this, like, my first draft of a survey is always like embarrassing garbage that I would never want to share with anyone. It sort of just has this like, verbal diarrhea of every remotely related question or item or concept or term or number of scales that sort of relate to this big question that I have. And then you sort of want to break it down and group it into themes or into, areas, or, if you have a pre-post group or an experimental, kind of like you're adding a tutorial, looking at the tutorial versus the overall experience, things like that. So yeah, I'm all for kind of that big picture approach, but I think then weeding it down, sometimes your question can get lost along the way. You're like, oh, I like the wording of that question, I'll include it, but it doesn't always make sense to include it. So again, just thinking about, if you think about it, it can help you go back and make sure that you are getting that data through your question. And this last point relates to this image that's here. Again, getting back to this idea about just because you could ask something doesn't mean that you should. So something that we commonly, less in the past few years, but that certainly I saw when I first started out as a researcher, was asking, for example, something like, what is your sex or what is your gender? Was just sort of a question that you included in every survey. It was always there. And for a long time, I didn't really question it. Personally, like my own background is in cognitive psychology, and before a participant did any sort of generic computer task, this is what we asked them, their age and their gender. I've never analyzed my data based on that, but it was just always something that was asked. And it took me a while to kind of realize how strange it was to ask for this type of information. Because how did that information relate to my research project or my research question? And so the same thing, think about within your own teaching and learning practices is, does knowing your participant's sex or gender actually relate to your research question? How will that inform the information that you're hoping to obtain? And rarely, that's not the motivation behind the work that you're doing. In some cases that it is, and that's fine to include it. And this image that's here is a recommendation from the Office of BC Registrars that looks at gender identity. So it's sort of an example of one of the recommendations that they have, and that I would suggest using if it's important for your research to look at something like gender. I think the takeaway here is just sort of like, at least for me coming out of psychology, there's sort of this like standard or status quo that exists, and it's important to question. It feels easy to just be like, oh, we should ask them their age and their gender, their first language. But if that's not important for the research, it can be quite jarring to a student to, they open the survey and usually those items come at the top and they see, okay, you want this demographic information about me. Now, how does that influence the rest of my responses? And how am I thinking about this survey? Well, this is how I identify, and so this is how they're going to perceive my responses. You can create some bias in your responses that you get that way. So just something to consider when thinking about the types of questions you can ask. And again, this comes back to this idea of, you can add a lot of questions to your survey, but they could be influencing your responses. And they're also just making your survey longer. And if you don't need to include them, then don't. Okay, I just want to pause for a moment here. And I'm just going to check in with Bruce if there are any burning questions that have come up in the chat that I should stop and address. Take a minute now.
Thank you, Trish. Maybe you could speak to how do you balance the need for your own feedback information that you're seeking and not contributing to further survey fatigue. First thing that came up to my mind was keeping the design of your research actually contained so your survey is not too long. And I was wondering if you could also offer some views in regards to this last question that was posed.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think right now, I certainly am receiving a lot of survey requests, and I'm not a student, so I can only imagine how many students are getting right now at a time that's critical. I think that's the thing that's hard is saying, oftentimes we're requesting feedback because it will help us change the practices that we're doing or something that we plan to implement with the intent of improving the student learning experience or improving our own teaching ability. And so kind of balancing you don't want to fatigue your students with yet another request, but you also want to be able to benefit and have them benefit from that feedback. And so I think, as Bruce said, most importantly is focusing on, as few questions as possible while getting your question answered. So as few survey questions as possible while getting your overall question answered. So keeping the survey as short as possible. I think the second most important, or perhaps the most important piece, is being really clear with your students about why you're requesting this feedback and the value that it has for them to share their responses with you. So I think, curating, a few sentences or taking some time in class to talk about, why you're doing this survey and how it will actually help. I find that when I help facilitate surveys in classrooms, this really helps, and I believe it helps increase response rates. I'm helping with a project right now, and we're in our third iteration of doing surveys in different classrooms. And I've been able to talk to the students about the actual changes that have been implemented. So I can say things like, 2 semesters ago, this is a project about peer group work. And I can say something like, 2 projects ago, the group sizes were quite variable. The instructor didn't have set limits, but based on the feedback, she's been able to understand that students really suffer when the classroom or when the group size is larger than 6 students, for example. Again, this is just within this one setting, so I'm not trying to talk about group size in general as an overall view, just in this specific example. So I'm able to provide feedback to students. This is how past students felt. We got that understood that feeling through this survey. And now the instructor has implemented this change to better enhance your experience. So they can actually see this sort of seemingly small, tangible change that's taken place. Or something, it could be something like, if you're using a new teaching tool, talking about feedback that you've gotten from students. Why are you implementing this tool? Why are you trying to get their feedback? What do you hope that they will get out of this experience? And it's hard sometimes, that the feedback that you get can't be implemented right away. It's something that will take time to develop, and you have to redesign the course in order to implement. But I think just being really clear on the purpose of the survey and how their data will be used, and I'll touch, I think, in the next slide a little bit more about data privacy and anonymity and things like that. But being clear with them about why their responses are valuable, I think that can be a huge boost to students wanting to participate. And it doesn't reduce the fatigue. They still have to do something, but I think there becomes value behind what they're doing. Anything else burning in the chat, Bruce?
No, we're just having a conversation about offering donuts, and it works when it's in person, but as it was suggested, it would be harder to actually invite people to participate. Yeah. I think the mention is actually providing
incentive.
Yeah, providing the reasons why students are taking the survey and who will benefit. And if sometimes we'll talk about that too, offering some marks like 0.5% for taking the time to complete it might be another incentive that could replace the donut issue right now. So yes, thanks everyone.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about incentives in a couple of slides, actually. But yeah, I certainly wish that I would do many surveys for donuts in exchange for donuts. Absolutely. Yeah, great. Thank you, Bruce. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a few more pieces around best practices in survey design. So again, in thinking about designing your questions, think about what will students be able to recall about what you're asking. So see this sometimes in alumni surveys where it's been maybe 5-10 years since they participated in a certain course or program. And I think just try to put yourself in the student's shoes in terms of, what do you expect them to remember, and sort of how true do you expect those memories to be? So thinking about, specific aspects of a course, even, so that's one example for something like an alumni survey, but even within a specific course, so say you're teaching this semester, and you want to ask a survey, you know, a student might not remember how many lectures they were, or, you know, a certain piece of information about one specific lecture if you ask it, you know, weeks and weeks after it's happened. So thinking about timing of surveys is one thing. You know, if there's a nuanced component of a course or a lecture that you want feedback on, ask about it relatively soon after. But just thinking about how much the level of detail that you're including in the question, or that you expect students to have to recall information about. Another really critical piece is asking someone to take the survey before you share it. So this could be a colleague, a TA for the course, another instructor. Just asking them to review the items can be really helpful. It will help with things like reducing jargon. There might be, you know, a concept that you're thinking about that you're trying to capture, perhaps something like self-efficacy. So simply asking someone like, you know, what is your level of self-efficacy? Or I don't know if you would ask that anyway, but you might think about a concept that makes sense to you, but might not make sense to the student. And so looking at ways to make sure that what you're asking about is clear. So even if, you know, the concept you're asking about is self-efficacy, making sure that you're asking about it in a way that students will understand, either by changing the wording of the question or by making sure that you define it in advance. Having someone take the survey in advance also helps you determine how long it takes to do the survey. So you might think, oh, you know, this is only 10 questions, shouldn't take that long. But you also want students to actively engage in it. And so understanding, you know, if you have many items that are open text where they can freely type their responses, might take them a while to actually get through the survey. So having just a few people pilot it for you can help you understand, you know, how clear the questions are, if there's any type of confusion, how long the survey will take, as well as any sort of technical issues that might come up with things like branching, or you know, sometimes you forget to finish a thought before you save a survey. It's happened to me once or twice. Always helpful to have someone else review it before you share it with potentially hundreds of students. Also thinking about which questions require answers. So a good idea to always let students refuse to answer, like to leave a question blank, or have an option that says prefer not to answer. If this is an item that you think like, oh, no one's going to want to answer this, maybe it's not a good idea to include it in your survey. But there could be information that perhaps is a little bit less relevant, or perhaps is a little bit more sensitive, that is valuable to be answered, and including the option for them to skip that question is a good idea. On the other hand, thinking about questions that do require answers, thinking about, say you're trying to capture something about a specific tutorial that students participated in, it would be really valuable to know in advance whether they actually attended that tutorial. So having your first question be, you know, did you attend the tutorial on using R for data organization? Yes or no. For students who said yes, maybe they get a subset of questions. Students who said no, maybe get a different subset, or don't actually have to answer the survey at all. But something like that, you would want to make sure that you flag that information so that the questions that you're asking are relevant to the students. Again, I talked about using previously validated surveys or subsets of questions. This isn't always possible, and this isn't to say that you have to do this every single time. Depending on what your questions are, it might not make sense. But if you're looking at something like motivation or self-efficacy or confidence in a certain course style, there might be pre-validated surveys that exist that would be helpful to you to help. Oftentimes these will have like sub-constructs. So, you know, looking at overall motivation, but then, you know, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Maybe extrinsic motivation is really useful. So you could use that subset of questions. In the situation where it makes sense, again, this relies on you being able to go and look into the literature and find these surveys and find, or these questions and find that, what's relevant to you. But again, also with using pre-validated surveys, remembering that the context really matters. So, you know, maybe there's a survey on self-efficacy you found, but it's within a very specific, chemistry setting where they use tutorials and they're asking about this certain type of practice that might not generalize to the class that you're in. So just because something's been validated doesn't mean that it makes sense for you. So just something to keep in mind. At the end of the slides, in the appendix, I guess I'll call it, there are some examples of different pre-validated surveys that we've used before. Again, just some examples for you to think about and to know that they exist. Okay, so I want to spend a few minutes on this point. I'm just looking at the time here. Okay, spend one quick minute on this point because it's really important. Before we just had it sort of as a side piece. But I really want to highlight the importance of obtaining student consent. So when you're designing a survey, you might be doing so just to gather student feedback and to evaluate classroom practices and understand what's working and what's not working in the context. You might be collecting a student survey to answer a very specific research question that you're planning to publish on, and that's motivated by a theoretical background, and that you've gone and gotten approval from the Behavioral Research Ethics Board. Those are kind of two different pieces of ways to collect information. I'm not going to go into too much detail with those there. Regardless of why you're collecting data or what you plan to do with it, you always have to obtain student consent. And you say, oh, Trish, but I just want to, read it and think about it and redesign this one lecture based on what students say. You still need to make sure that they're okay with you collecting their data and using that information. I'm going to ask my colleague Bruce to share a link in the chat to a sample consent form that we often use and kind of tweak and revise based on the course and the project, just to help you get a sense of how short this can be and how simple it can be. Again, this is another place that can be useful for you to spend some time explaining to students why you're doing what you're doing and motivate them to participate in the survey. But it also really clearly lines out what you plan to do with that student data. So being clear on your intent, will this be shared with the whole department, with a specific project team? Who will be analyzing the data? Will the data remain anonymous? Are you collecting student IDs? Is your TA going to be reviewing it? How that information is being used is really important. Another piece that's in this example that Bruce is sharing is about getting their consent to use quotes. So oftentimes you collect the student data and you think like, okay, I'm going to change my classroom practice or implement this new tool based on what I hear. And that's sort of the expectation. Then you get really rich feedback from students and they talk about like, they love this tool and it was life-changing, and they have these really rich, awesome quotes that you want to be able to share. Unless you've explicitly asked to be able to use their direct quotes, you cannot do so. You can say, students loved it, they thought it was outstanding. You can summarize that feedback, but being able to actually use their quotes, even if anonymous, you need to obtain their consent in advance. So I just really want to highlight how critical this piece is about being clear. And I keep using students here, but if you're collecting feedback from alumni or from other faculty members or colleagues or your teaching team, this all applies. So just again, being really clear about how the data is being collected, where the data will be stored, where it will be used, and the specifics of what will be used, either a summary of their responses or direct quotes, is really, really important.
If I may jump in, Trish, because there was a question about obtaining BRAB or non-BRAB, because the sample consent that we shared has a non-BRAB. As part of the scholarly integrity policies that UBC has established, we are obliged to keep any sort of evaluation that we do with our classrooms transparent to our participants, and obtaining consent of use will communicate to our participants why they're participating and how their data will be used. So it's not necessarily just obtaining BRAB or not BRAB. It's also part of UBC's scholarly integrity policies to be transparent participants and why we're engaging in sort of evaluation with them. So I hope that clarifies the question.
Awesome, thanks, Bruce. And actually, for those interested, we are hosting, Bruce and myself are hosting another workshop at the end of March about doing ethical research in teaching and learning contexts, where we talk a little bit about whether you need to obtain BREB approval or not. That's a foreshadowing, that's like a month and a half from now. But we do also have a number of resources on the Institute for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning website that help you break down about whether your project needs to go through the BREB approval process or not. I don't have too much time, we don't have too much time to talk about that today, but there are resources there as well. And also feel free to connect with myself or Bruce if you have more follow-up questions. Okay, so the next thing is I just want to quickly showcase a few different types of questions. So as I mentioned earlier, UBC uses Qualtrics as our local surveying, online surveying tool. And if you're not familiar with it, I just wanted to highlight some of the multitude of options that you have for sharing questions. So one example is close-ended or forced choice questions. So these are questions where you provide an overview question and then provide specific options for students. And these are most useful where you have a sense of the range of answers that you want to include. So when you're asking about, specific workshops that someone might like to attend or ranking some type of activity. Other examples of this would be things like ratings or grids. The also quite common one we see is Likert scales. So where you have people respond on a range of answers. So something like strongly agree to strongly disagree. And with Likert scales, there's a lot of information on the internet about Likert scales, and I just want to highlight a few key points. One being to avoid using phrases like always or never, because those types of extremes are quite difficult to respond on. And when it makes sense, having an option like does not apply or I do not know. So this could be something like if you're asking students to respond about a specific tutorial and you're asking them to reply to a number of questions, but perhaps they only attended part of the tutorial. So giving them the option to say, oh, actually this question isn't applicable to me is really helpful so that they're not just picking a response at random. The other piece of information is that with Likert scales, the best practice is to use between 5 and 7 options. So in this example that you see here, there's 5 options of strongly disagree to strongly agree. The other option for a type of survey question would be to use an open-ended question. And so this is appropriate if a question can't easily be answered, or you anticipate that you really don't know what the students will have to say. What did you like most about the course? Or is there anything that you would like changed about the course? Or what could be done to improve the course? Those are really common open-ended questions. Just something to be mindful of is that they do take more time to respond to. It can be difficult to code those answers and will take more time for someone to code. So just a little bit more skill is required depending on the depth of the response that you are expecting there. Okay, so I know we had some questions at the beginning about how to increase response rates. So I'm just going to take a few minutes now to talk about that. So I've already touched on this point a bit actually about just being open with students about the purpose and what they're going to get out of this survey. I think that's really the number one piece for increasing response rates, but also just improving student engagement and kind of that connection, showing them that, as an instructor, as a facilitator, you really want to understand their experience and that, this survey is to help improve it, perhaps not in this moment, but overall, I think that's really valuable. Sending them reminders, so checking in, and if you have a survey that's open for 2 weeks, for example, typically I see you get the most responses within the first 2 or 3 days, and then it peters off to basically nothing. If you send a reminder, you see a bit of quite a substantial spike often in response rates. We touched a little bit on incentives. And so the idea here is you can include incentives, but don't coerce your students, and you should always have a choice for them to participate. So the most common thing that I've experienced is providing a small bonus for completing the survey. So if they can complete the survey, they get an extra half credit or 1 credit bonus added to a specific project or assignment, but also giving them an alternative. So maybe they don't feel comfortable doing that survey, giving them an alternative of a short written assignment or some kind of review or some other submission where they get that same bonus without having to do the survey. This creates equal ground so that people who maybe don't want to do the survey or feel, for whatever reason, don't want to participate, they still have an opportunity. So it's, again, being inclusive to everyone in the class and giving everyone that opportunity. Providing donuts to the class for doing a survey, if you have the funding and budget to do that. Sometimes people will do something like, provide the opportunity to win a gift card or something like that. I see that rare in student or program level surveys and more broader UBC initiatives. So yeah, certainly that's an option as well. I think the most important piece is just making sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate and have their view heard, their opinion heard. Again, keep your survey short, under 15 minutes if possible. Again, having someone test it out and preview it for you can really help with this. Branching questions. So this relates to the idea I indicated before, where say you're looking at experiences with doing a tutorial versus not. You don't want to have everyone answer all of the same questions because it's not relevant. So within Qualtrics, you can set it up. So depending on what a response is, participants will be asked a certain number of questions, and another group would be asked a number of other questions. So say they said that they never attended the tutorial, you probably want to know why, but that question is only relevant to those people. So you can set up the survey so that questions are only relevant to those who select specific responses. And again, just really getting back to that point of just because you could ask something doesn't mean you should. Keeping your surveys as concise as possible and really targeting what your research and evaluation goals are. Okay, a few more tips in terms of increasing response rate. If it's possible, having the students complete it in class or as part of something related to the course itself. Always giving them the option to complete it at a later time. You might say, oh, the survey should only take 5 minutes, but that doesn't mean every student will only take 5 minutes. That's simply an average. So giving students the opportunity to really feel like they're able to express their full views without having to rush through. This isn't really feasible now, giving a paper copy, but if you're doing an online survey, again, giving them the option, they could print it out at home and perhaps scan it, or have someone fill it out for them, just giving different options depending on people's accessibility needs. Also be mindful of the best time to administer a survey. So don't schedule your surveys near exams or when final assignments are due, religious holidays, or months and months after the course is over. Again, motivate students as best you can to do it when they're not feeling overwhelmed and overworked by other activities. Giving them a deadline so that they know, it's only open for this window. It's not something that they can keep putting off. Making the survey anonymous, so not requiring things like student information, like student ID or names. There might be cases where you're doing a repeated survey and you're tracking responses over time, in which case you do need to ask for their ID. That's absolutely fine. Again, just being clear with why you're asking for that information, being clear about how the data will be processed and kept confidential. It's really important. And I think that's my last point. Okay, I see that it's already 2:55 and I haven't talked as quickly as I hoped I had. So I'm going to actually stop here. I'm just going to quickly point out the rest of the slides and then open up the last 5 minutes for questions and hopefully get back to some of those items people had burning. Activity 2 just looks at this survey, which are a number of items that we've either seen or ones that we've written early on in our careers that aren't ideal. And I was hoping to work through them with all of you, but we don't have time. So they're here. You have a copy of the slides. In the comments of the slides, I break down why each of these questions isn't ideal and how it could be reframed. So it's something for you to look at and review. I want to thank you all for attending. At the end of these slides, I'm going to, again, just quickly go through them, some additional resources, some examples of Likert scale items, which, again, just a popular method for asking questions, and some examples of pre-validated questionnaires. So I'm going to stop there and open up the floor for questions.